Hi everyone, it's Marla here, and I did manage to get another video made for this Tuesday. As many of you know, I made two videos last week, my regular Tuesday video and then my collaborative group video, Red, White, and Beautiful, that went out on Friday. So if you haven't seen that, please check it out. After spending over a month in California at my daughter's, I am finally back home in Las Vegas. However, these projects were completed while I was in Southern California, and I hope you enjoy them as much as I do. Number 4 is my favorite. It's absolutely stunning, so make sure you stay until the end of the video. I took a departure from my normal upcycling in the past couple of videos, doing my groovy 1960s, 70s guitar in one, and then very Americana in Friday's video. But this week, I am back to the French country cottage that we all love. And so, without further ado, let's get started with this week's projects. I'm actually going to call the first project Project 1.5, and in the end you'll see why. I started out with another one of my slat wall hangings. It could also be a shelf sitter. I took it outside, tried to sand as much of the lettering off as possible, and then because I wanted to put some decoupage paper on it, I gave it 2 good coats of DIY clay paint in the color White Swan. After the paint dried, I got out my Pentart decoupage glue and varnish, and I laid a coat down on that first slat, and I had a piece of decoupage paper I had cut from a Upcycled masterboard, and I had cut it to fit this with just a slight overlap. I dampened the paper with some water, and then I laid it down on that first slat where I had the decoupage medium. And then I used a little bit more of the medium to go over the top and smooth out any wrinkles. I continued to add the decoupage medium to each of the slats, working my way down to the bottom of the project. Once I was completely finished applying the decoupage paper, then I went back and gave the entire project an additional coat of the decoupage glue and varnish, just to make sure that the decoupage paper was protected. Once the paper had dried completely, I used my finger sander to go along the edges and remove any of the excess paper. When I was planning out this project, I decided that I wanted to use a paper that could serve as a background for some of the beautiful flowers in the most recent transfer book, Flowers by the Poets. I absolutely love the irises that are in this book. They remind me of my mother. She always had irises in her garden, and so I chose 2 different large transfers of irises to put on the board. At first I was a little disappointed that I had to cut one of the transfers apart to make it fit, but I knew that I would definitely be able to use the cutoff piece on another project. I laid the transfer down and then used the transfer stick that's included with every IOD transfer book to lay the transfer down on the paper, and then I used the carrier sheet to burnish it. I then did the same thing with the other transfer I had chosen. I decided to add this little bird to the transfer or to the project as well, and then I went back and used a few pieces that I had cut off to add some more flowers, and then I chose a butterfly to add to the project as well. As a final touch, I went around the edges of the project with my vintage antiquing paste to give the picture a little more dimension, and then I sealed everything in with a coat of Sweet Pickins satin top coat. You'll see later in the video that I used some green paint to blend in a decoupage paper, and I had some paint left over, so I painted this little sign that I picked up, I think for $1 at Goodwill. And I decided I wanted to use the irises that I had cut off of the transfer on this little sign. And so I just quickly put this together, but I think it turns out really cute. I had noticed in one of the stencils I brought along that there was some lettering that says Iris de Parma. And so I thought it would be cute to stencil that on and then put the iris transfers around it. I used Fusion Mineral Paint in the color Raw Silk to stencil it. And then I went back with a fine artist brush to connect the letters because I like them to not look so much like they came from a stencil. I think the hardest part of this little project was deciding where to put the irises. I did end up cutting the transfers apart even more, but then it's easy to go back and add the extra flowers that you cut off. And so that's what I did. I'll just let you watch this process. I had to cut apart the large iris, but I didn't want it to look like it was just floating there, so I did add some stems to the bottom. And then I filled in the gaps with other pieces that I had cut from the transfer. In the end, I think it just looked like the iris was growing behind the lettering. I used that same Sweet Pickins top coat to seal in my transfers. And then I did a little aging around the edge of the sign. And I finished off the project with a little bow. You'll have to let me know what you think of both of these projects, or my project and a half, in the comments. There's a little thrift store close to where my daughter lives that I like to visit whenever I'm in California. I picked up this little box. It was just a little black wooden box, and I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do with it, so I started out by painting it white. And then I had also purchased a package of assorted napkins from Amazon. And so I decided I was going to decoupage some of the napkins onto the box. I'll leave the link for the packages, or the package of napkins that I purchased. I love the idea that you can get a package that has several different napkins in it, as opposed to just buying a package with 12 of the same napkins. And so I chose 2 napkins that I thought went well together. This one here with the pink roses and the little pink bird, and then you'll see another one that has sort of a French flair to it. I did use my Pentart decoupage glue and varnish to put these down, but napkins are so thin that when I decoupage with them, I don't spray them with water as I would regular decoupage paper. I put a few cuts in the edges, deciding that I wanted to wrap this napkin around the edges of the lid. The decoupage paper that I chose to go with my lid has a couple of Paris landmarks on it. I think one of the images has the Eiffel Tower and the other one the Arc de Triomphe. And so it worked out perfectly. I needed 4 pieces for the 4 sides of the box, and the napkin gave me 4 pieces. It was a 2-ply napkin. I tend to like 3-ply, but the 2-ply worked perfectly fine. Just make sure if you're using a napkin that you separate the plies and you use just the very top sheet that has the printing on it. After the napkins had dried, I used my finger sander to go around the edges and remove any of the excess paper. I wanted to add a little bit of decoration to the box, plus I wanted to cover up the edges of the box where the two pieces of the napkins came together. And so I took out this burlap trim that I had brought with me and used my hot glue gun to glue a piece onto the four corners of the box. I used my scissors to trim the ribbon at the top and the bottom, and then went back with my glue gun to make sure that any loose strands were glued down. Whenever I'm using resin to pour molds, I pour as many molds as possible so I have some on hand. So I had this mold here, and I thought it would be perfect on the top of the box, so I gave it a coat of dark brown paint, and then I went over the top of that with some vintage gold rub and buff, and I think it was just the perfect piece for the top of this pretty little box. To finish the box, I gave all of the sides and the lid a coat of my Fusion antiquing gel. I wanted it to look older and a little more vintage, and I thought that the napkins, although they were very pretty, were a little bit bright for my taste. So I just used a brush to paint it on and then a wet wipe to dab it back. As you can see here, I had also added another little mold to the front of the box. I really love the way this little box turned out, and I think the addition of the antiquing gel was exactly what it needed. Let me know what you think in the comments. For project 3, I grabbed these two little metal totes that I picked up at Goodwill several months ago. They were cute. They had kind of a farmhouse look to them, but again, they were just too mass-produced, or at least that's how they looked to me. And so I decided I wanted to do something a little different with them. And in that middle stripe where they had the farm feed or whatever that said there, I decided I was going to put a paint inlay. Now you can put paint inlays into a lot of different mediums. I have used mineral paint, clay paint, top coat. I've even put them over milk paint. But I have found that for me they work best when I put them into clay paint. So I painted the center section of each of these totes with DIY's white Swan. I really love the small inlay book that IOD came out with this summer called Little Lark. It has some beautiful little scenes with a lot of foliage and birds, and so I chose 4 of those to put on my totes. I put down a nice layer of the white Swan paint, and then I sprayed the back of the inlays. I like to spray mine on the paint side. Some people spray them on the other side. Obviously it works either way, but I always spray mine on the paint side, and then I lay that down directly into the wet paint, use my fingers to smooth it out, and then I spray it again with water and dab off the excess with a paper towel. You'll know when the inlays are completely dry because they turn sort of an opaque white. I spray them down with water a second time, using my paper towel to take off the excess, and then you can peel the inlay off and look at that beautiful image that transferred into that paint. I love using inlays. I was a little nervous about using them in the beginning, but now they are one of my favorite things to use. I decided that I was going to use Fusion's Prairie Sunset mineral paint to paint the tubs. I really like that bright yellow. Of course, I will age it, as I always do, but I think it was beautiful with the paint inlays. And in a few minutes, you'll see the end results. It did take several coats to get the intensity of the yellow that I wanted over the top of that green, but the paint dries pretty fast, and so it didn't take very long to get the totes painted. After the paint had dried completely, then I went over the top of it with my Fusion antiquing gel. And then I pulled out some sunflower transfers from the new IOD transfer book called Flowers by the Poets. I wanted to add some flowers to at least one side of the totes just to give it more interest, and I really love the sunflowers. That have a very, very summery feel to me. I should probably mention that before I applied the transfers, I did take the totes outside and I gave them a coat of Rust-Oleum clear matte spray, not only to seal in the paint, but definitely to seal in the paint inlays. And then I cut the transfers to size, and they went over that clear matte spray very easily. I chose some daisies from that same transfer book to go with my sunflowers. I think they complemented each other very well. Even though the paint was sealed in, I needed to seal in my transfers, so I gave each tote a coat of clear wax. I love how these little totes turned out. If you want to show the flowers, then you can have that side facing forward. But you'll see in the pictures that if you turn them around, it's just the tote with the paint inlays, which is also a nice look. I'm not going to lie, but Project 4 is by far my favorite project of this video. While I was in California, I received my order of Connie, the Painted Photographer's new summer decoupage papers. And as soon as I saw the Swan, I knew I had to do something beautiful with it. I had brought an oval round from IOD with me, and the Swan was going to fit perfectly in this round. So I was very excited to do this project. I wanted to use milk paint, so I started out by giving the oval a coat of DIY's Dark and Decrepit liquid patina. Not only did I want to darken the wood, I wanted to make sure I had a resist between the porous wood and the milk paint, so I would get the cracking and chipping that I love in milk paint. I decided to give the oval 2 coats of the Dark and Decrepit liquid patina to make sure that I had really sealed in that porous wood. I brought several colors of milk paint with me, but none of them were the exact color that I wanted for this project. So I made a custom mixture. I used that decoupage paper to guide me. I started out with creamy, and then I added a little bit of basil to that. And then I decided, after looking at the paper, I needed a little bit of blue. And so I took the color Kent, which is one of the bespoke colors, and I added a little bit of it to my mixture as well. I was very happy with the color that I achieved. As you can see, it matched the decoupage paper perfectly. I gave the frame 2 coats of the sagey green milk paint using my hairdryer to dry in between coats, and as I was hoping, I did see that beautiful crackle start to form. I always like to give my projects at least 2 coats of the milk paint to ensure that I have full coverage. And whenever possible, I do use a heat source to dry my milk paint. I think speeding up the drying process really helps you achieve that beautiful crackle. Now you might be wondering why I'm getting out my beeswax bar and going over this milk paint. Well, that's because I had decided I was going to paint this with 2 different colors of milk paint. I wanted it to look old, and so I wanted it to look like it had been painted more than once over the years. And the beeswax bar would allow my second color of paint to chip away or not stick to those areas where I had applied it. For my second coat of paint, I decided just to go with the Sweet Pickens milk paint color, Creamy. I didn't videotape myself putting on that second coat of milk paint, but after I did, I got out the hairdryer and started drying it, and you can see up towards the top right corner of the frame that I was already getting some of that chipping I was hoping for, and the green paint was showing through. I had recently purchased this beautiful stencil from Upcycled, and I knew it was going to be the perfect frame for my Swan. I experimented with this stencil and some of this light structure paste that's made by Pentart while I was at Royce's retreat, and I really loved the effect. And so I decided to use that same technique of laying down the stencil and then spreading a very thin coat of the structure paste over it to highlight the swan. Now there is a reflection of the swan in the water, and a little bit of that got covered up with this structure paste, but I didn't mind. The effect of this frame around the swan is absolutely beautiful, and you'll see in just a minute. Using the stencil paste with the stencil is sort of like using a paint inlay. You're always hoping when you lift it that you get great results, and look at that. Just gorgeous. After the stencil paste dried, then I laid the decoupage paper down inside the oval and used my fingers to trace around the rim, and then I used the water method to tear away the edges of the decoupage paper so I would have a nice organic edge and not perfectly cut straight lines. If the decoupage paper had covered the entire oval, then cutting it with scissors would have been fine, but I knew that I was going to have to do some blending around the edges, and that's part of the reason that I wanted torn edges on my decoupage paper. Before applying the decoupage paper, I had painted the oval, the center of the oval, with 2 coats of Fusion Mineral Paint in the color Raw Silk, and then I used the Pentart decoupage varnish and glue to lay down the decoupage paper. I used a very light hand when I went over the structure paste the first time with the decoupage medium. I wanted to make sure that all the little particles of structure paste were sealed down onto the decoupage paper. After I got the paper down, then it was time to get out some paint so I could mix colors together to do my blending. You can see I have a variety of colors here: blue, green, brown, ivory, and even some black. And I had just used a small artist brush and a piece of plastic to mix on, and just mix the colors until I thought they matched what was in the decoupage paper. Once I was satisfied with the color that I had mixed, I used a small artist brush to start blending in the edges of the decoupage paper. As I worked my way down towards the gold color, I realized that I was going to have to get out the yellow and mix some of that. It took a few minutes to get a color that was close to what was on the decoupage paper with the colors that I had, but I was finally able to achieve a color that blended very well. And I actually enjoy the blending part. It's very relaxing, and I think that the more I blend, the better I get at it. So if you haven't tried blending, you should give it a try. The one thing I tell myself is it's just paint, and so if you put the paint on and it doesn't match, you don't like the way it looks, you can always paint right over the top of it. After I'd finished with all of my blending, I got out my antiquing gel and went over the frame. Normally with milk paint I would use Sweet Pickens dark oil wax, but I really wanted the cracks to show, and I didn't want to get any of the oil on my decoupage paper, take a chance of that, and so I just used the antiquing paste, and it worked very well, or antiquing gel in this case. To add a little aging to the inside of the frame, I went around the rim with some of the antiquing gel and then went over the top of that with DIY's Decrepit Dust. I love the way it makes the piece look like it is old and that maybe over the years a little bit of dirt and dust have settled in these areas. I decided for a frame, a picture this beautiful, it had to have a little more ornamentation. I love the French country look, and so I poured a resin mold. I didn't show that because the video would be an hour long, but I poured a resin mold and then I used some of that green paint I had mixed up to do my blending, and I painted the molds with that green paint. Then I went over the top of them with the antiquing gel, and for a final touch, after the gel had dried, I used my finger to put a little bit of the vintage gold rub and buff on both of the molds. I used a brush to put a pretty heavy coat of the rub and buff in the center of my mold, and then just used my fingers again to continue to go over the raised areas lightly until I achieved the effect that I wanted. I think I mentioned at the beginning of this project that it was my absolute favorite, and it truly is. I think it just turned out gorgeous. I hope Connie sees this so she can see how beautiful her paper is. And I think I used every brand of product I carry, from Upcycled to Pent Art to Sweet Pickins to DIY to IOD. They're all in there. But what a beautiful, beautiful project this turned out to be. Please let me know what you think in the comments. If you're still with me, thank you so much for taking the time to watch my video. I apologize if you hear a cat meowing in the back, but we have a new adopted puppy, and he and the cat have not quite come to an agreement yet. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the projects in the video. If you're not currently a subscriber, please consider subscribing to my channel. Give me a thumbs up. Leave a comment. I love to read your comments. Hype the video. That definitely helps get it out to a wider audience. And I'm going to go enjoy the rest of the day with my husband. Today is our 25th wedding anniversary. And then I will start working on projects for next week's video. Please enjoy the rest of your week. Bye-bye.